How do I sound?
Sound good. Sound clear.
Am I coming in hot? Am I coming in hot?
You're looking hot though between the tie dye and the sunglasses. What's going on over there?
This shirt actually, so every year we go on vacation to Myrtle Beach, right? And I don't know when they started doing it, but it became a little bit of a tradition that they would tie dye shirts while we were there. And then once Emily figured out how to do the whatever you call it, like the vinyl transfer stuff, she started
Yeah.
putting like logos on them and that kind of thing. And so this is this year's Myrtle Beach T-shirt. And it's a little bit strong for my taste. It's however, my daughter is in the office with me today, and she's wearing her shirt, and she wanted to match, and so she asked if I would wear my shirt today, and I thought, that makes a lot of sense. So
It does.
yeah,
Not only is it very fatherly, but there's not too many family vacations that they have their own custom T-shirt.
no, that's
That,
when you know you've arrived.
that is pretty impressive. If I can build and
Yeah.
install my own pacemaker,
Yeah.
I can make a vacation T-shirt for my family.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They voted on the logo and everything. And it's appropriate because I was saying I feel a little bit like I've been on vacation. It's been a nice, relaxing weekend.
Absolutely.
You know,
Did
like,
anything happen this weekend?
yeah.
I was kind of checked out. I got a new dog, the whole thing. I didn't even check in. Did you do anything this weekend?
I'm taking that one of those time management approaches where I refuse to check Slack over the weekend. It's worked really, really well. Our numbers may go down on Zendesk just a little bit, but that's the way it's going.
A little bit.
Mm.
Well, luckily you and I were on the duty this weekend because the transfer, the last transfer to Reliable Site, we'll get to that, was not clean.
From Reliable Site, not to.
From Reliable, yeah. From Reliable Site.
Yeah.
Was a
Yeah.
pain in the ass.
No, and I guess we should give a little bit of backstory here. So, we started with Reliable Site, right? Like that was the first company that we went with when we started the company in 2013 and bought a single server, and it was just one dedicated server. And the reasoning for that being several, one of them is that it was very cost effective. I'm trying to remember, it was probably what, like $150 a month or something like that. I don't remember what it ended up costing, but you could buy a dedicated server. It had a decent amount of storage space, and it met the needs at the time in 2013. At the time, a lot of the virtual offerings really struggled in terms of storage space. I would say it wasn't necessarily. I don't know that DigitalOcean was around. I think they were
They
around.
just were.
They just started
started
in that year. Yeah.
I think they just had SSD drives, but they were really small storage,
Well,
right?
that's the thing. Yeah. So them and Linode and all these other places that were doing virtual private servers and virtual obviously was appealing even back then. But the issue being, if you got 40 gigs of hard drive space, that doesn't last very long. And we even started, do you remember, like our original plans were like only 1 gigabyte. And
Yeah.
we didn't have a faculty plan. We didn't have an org plan. It was like all you got was 1 gig of space. No, we were offering free hosting with a domain. So we could
Sure. It was
legitimately offer
$12
that.
for everything.
Yeah, but even then, it was like, okay, storage is kind of like, there were a lot of other cheap hosting providers that were saying, hey, unlimited storage. And we were just sort of like, no, we're not going to go that far. When, we do recognize that there are some limits on this stuff. And so, we had that one dedicated server. I think that expanded in, probably early spring to our second server, and things just grew from there. But I would say at least for the next 2.5 years, at least, we were buying dedicated servers every time we needed one. Now, we weren't growing quite as fast as we do today. I think anyway, we set up more servers today on a week by week basis than back then. It was sort of like, okay, new semester, do we need one new server? Whereas now it's sort of like, from one week to the next, it's like we might need a new server for any specific project or things like that. And so,
Well, it's also,
yeah,
I
go
mean,
ahead.
no, but it's also the idea that, we're deploying a lot of servers, but we had this relationship with Reliable Site, pretty consistently for 2.5 years. I think our last school that we did on Reliable Site was UMW.
Hmm.
And then we just moved them, but that was the last one where it was dedicated 3 servers. And then we had a couple, but like we basically, when you said, look, DigitalOcean now offers block storage, it opens up our opportunity to host, shared hosting and school sites on DigitalOcean. We went full turkey. So we started around 2016, and just this weekend, and like we said, the Reliable Site, the final 2 servers were Beat Happening and Joy Division. They had a lot of users who had been with us from almost the beginning, and they'd probably been through a migration or 2 before. And it was just a heavy load, and it took us all weekend to transfer 660 sites. I mean,
Yeah.
or accounts. It was insane how long it took.
Yeah, and it's a struggle because on one hand, you're as accounts are coming over, they're coming back online on the new server, and then they're taking in traffic and doing their thing. And so the server almost has to function as a normal hosting server in addition to the load of continuing to migrate accounts over. And I would say you know, these were some legacy servers that we were moving over. And so the people who've stuck around with us are not typically the kind of folks who have a single blog or something. If you've had a hosting account for several years now, you probably have a lot of cruft. I know I was a perfect example of that. My account was on BeatHap and got moved over. And, I've probably got maybe 10 installs, maybe less, but, I've played with all manner of stuff. Some stuff's still active, some things just files in the system and that kind of thing. And so, even my account wasn't, a complete easy one to move over by any means. And I think a lot of them were that way, where you had folks running either large installs, had a lot of storage, or just a lot of different stuff going on.
Yeah, and it was gigs of stuff. Usually you'll get like a 200, 300 megabyte site. It goes
Sure.
boom, boom. This was like 5 gigs. And they would get like cPanel. It's interesting because when it hits a lot, it slows down on the transfers, and some of them just bottleneck it.
Yeah.
And so we were having to go in, kill transfers, redo them. And that was basically the weekend. That's what took so much time, is trying to monitor when stuff is going through, when it's not, trying to. And then the load on the server was hitting like 30 or 40. And it was like, what?
But so how did we fix this, right? So, and this is the beauty of sort of why we're going down this road is, one of the limitations, because it wasn't necessarily, I mean, we've had some issues in the past, I would say, with Reliable Site in terms of the way they supported things, for sure. No doubt about that. No doubt. But with any sort of unmanaged hosting provider, there's going to be that tenuous relationship where, some of the onus is on us to fix our things versus what's at the data center level for them to fix and that kind of stuff. But the real hard limitation that wasn't going to get past with dedicated servers was that what you bought at that time was what you got in terms of storage, in terms of CPU, in terms of memory. It was a dedicated server. If I needed to add more storage, not only would the server have to be completely offline, but we're not talking for, an hour or two. We're talking a support ticket in, dedicated downtime for somebody to put in more memory or to change out the hard drives. And the servers, they're just computers. They had like 4 hard drive bays. They were all in use with our system. So there was really no way for us to make upgrades over time. There was no way to expand disk storage or make them faster. And so obviously when you create your first server in 2013, technology moves pretty quickly. And so, what we found ourselves having to do is say, okay, well, if we want a better server, we would have to buy a new server and then migrate everybody over to it. And that's annoying. If people need more disk space, that's annoying to have to, then set up new servers and move them over. And so I think the goal always was, if possible, could we move towards a virtual system where we could expand disk storage on the fly, where, if we needed a larger server, we could do a quick reboot with a larger server. And so that actually came in really handy this weekend, didn't it?
It did. So we had to jump from 16 gigabytes to 48.
Mhm.
But when we did, and I'm not surprised because, like you said, we had a lot of super powered sites on it. I mean, people who use it. And I think it's comfortable. What we found with Sebadoh and some of the other transfers we did is after it settled in, after some of that, because it is a little bit intense, you can even maybe draw some of that back if it's still not pulling. But like, it's just beautiful to be able to say, okay, let's superpower it to get through the weekend and then reassess. But it's interesting because you're titled this show, which I think is right, from dedicated to virtual.
Mhm.
And what I've loved about it is, we've become pretty comfortable with doing these. We have a weekend plan and we've gone through, I don't know how many this summer, like 10, but we finished. We are off reliable site, which for me feels like a milestone for Reclaim. Because
Absolutely.
we planned this, we've been doing this for 2 years and we've been slowly moving stuff over. We've been planning this, and the fact that we just buckled down the last 2 years, our entire infrastructure, it's interesting, Tim, is no younger than 2017.
Yeah.
So everything we have is a server that we've, basically spun up. I think the oldest server right now we run is December 2016.
Yeah.
So basically less than 2 years old.
And that maps pretty closely to when DigitalOcean started offering block storage. They started, I believe, in the summer of that year, and we started doing some testing to see, is this going to be viable? Is this something that we could actually use? Because the block storage offering in DigitalOcean allowed us to have the nice fast virtual server, but have a terabyte of disk space or something like that. And so we really could start to mirror some of the setup that we had, through Reliable Site, but in a virtual instance. And so that's when we started making the move. But obviously, at that point, we were pretty well established and had a lot to move over. So yeah, and we've made a big push, especially in the last 6 months. And that's been a very good thing.
Yeah, we got cocky. Well, I don't know. It's just because he was old, but we're like, yeah, we're going to take 2 legacy ones and put them on one new one. But there's a certain virtue there because the latest DigitalOcean server for shared hosting is Clash, which was our first reliable site server. So there's a kind of nice, bookending the time of reliable site and everything over now on DigitalOcean. I just wanted to take a moment, Tim, if you don't mind, and read through some of the names because we've repurposed Clash.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But we could actually repurpose some of these. So here's some of the servers that ran on reliable site that we have retired. Bad Brains, Oklahoma's first.
That's right.
Banshees. Banshees was CSU Channel Islands.
Yep.
That's right. Heartbreakers was Emory. Ramones might be one we bring back soon. That was our second shared hosting server. Saints. Saints shared hosting. Hot Rods. Huskadoo. Minutemen. Butthole Surfers. God, the list. And then there's a bunch of university ones, but they were run on like Blondie, Generation X, Sonic Youth, Fugazi. We repurposed Fugazi. We actually have a second Fugazi server now. Replacements. These are all the servers that we actually have retired now. And then we got smart, and Tim was like, look, I can't keep up with these band names for these school servers, so we're going to actually name them after the school.
Yeah.
But we had, how many in total did we move from dedicated for reliable site?
So we had in total 36 dedicated servers at any given time in total that we purchased. And it's actually a good point what you mentioned about the schools and the way we were doing that, because this is actually not our first foray into virtual servers. It started a little bit as an experiment to see whether or not it was something we could run ourselves. And so, what we would do was buy a large dedicated server, much larger than the kind that we would buy for shared hosting. And then we would install software on there to make it virtual. We kind of were like, well, we'll give this a try. We were using a piece of software called Solus, Solus. Solus VM allowed you to install some software. It used KVM as the back end for creating these virtual environments. And so we would buy a large server, and then we would put three or four schools on there, and they were all their own dedicated virtual instance within this larger server. So they didn't necessarily have any cross communication between them, but they were all on the same box. And that was sort of our in between way to get the storage that we needed, but to also do something that was virtual. So we could, to some extent, increase the limits on things, change stuff around, expand the hard drive and stuff. But I think we found, we probably did that with Domain of One's Own for the first maybe 12 schools that we brought on, somewhere
That's right.
around there.
Yep.
And we were able to do Domain of One's Own very cost effectively that way. But I think we quickly found like running your own virtual environment was not a business we wanted to be in. In the same way that I don't necessarily want to run my own data center and have to manage servers in that sense, be driving up to Reston, Virginia, and late at night. As bad as this weekend was, it wasn't that.
It wasn't that.
And I could see it quickly devolving into that. So I'm more than happy to offload that level of infrastructure management to another company. And so, once we were able to start moving to DigitalOcean, we were able to provision VPSs directly with them, one per school, rather than having to do this weird situation where we would buy a big server and split it up ourselves. And so that increased, exponentially the number of migrations we had to do, because in addition to these, 30 some odd dedicated servers, we might have one server on Reliable Site, but we really have to move like 4 schools over in order to close down that one server. So it was quite a bit of work, and I'm glad to see that it's done.
Yeah, I mean, it was a drain. And it's nice too, because I mean, with DigitalOcean, it kind of dovetails nicely with a conversation we had on Friday, which Tony Hurst geniusly blogged up today. Was this idea of, in these virtual server environments like DigitalOcean, and we started looking, and we get this peek at what he's calling a serverless environment, where basically, the server, all of that stuff is taken care of behind you thanks to the containers. You don't see it as a client. But it would be interesting to see in another 5 years, like, what our server environment will look like. Will DigitalOcean be like, it's obviously been amazing for us, but like, you said how fast this moves. I wonder if there's a kind of serverless environment where we're starting to work with containers and APIs, and that stuff is provisioned, almost outside of our ken entirely.
Sure. Yeah. But the danger there is always, the joke, and I think I had a sticker on my laptop at some point that said this, like the cloud is just someone else's computer. And so like, what we might call serverless is absolutely not serverless. There are servers somewhere, but it's about who owns them and who's running them and who's managing that. And if it's not you, it's someone. And there's, don't get me wrong, there's total benefits to that, by any means. But like, I was just playing around this weekend with a piece of software, and I again tried the ZiteNow stuff to run it on that, and it started up cleanly, and I was like, oh, this is really awesome. And then I was going through the instructions on how to create an admin account, and they said, well, you open up the database and you have to run this SQL command, and I didn't have access to be able to do that at all. And I was like, oh, okay. So like, they had a Docker container, it started up automatically, everything was running, but without that level of access, I couldn't get any further. So I think there's a balance there, a marriage between not just the hardware and the infrastructure, but also the software is going to have to evolve too, to be able to use it in those environments. That was something that struck me as well. Not everyone's obviously going to need to be able to do that, but Omeka, if you need to upload a plugin or theme, you have to have FTP. So you have to have access to the file system. And in places like WordPress.com, you don't. Places, there are some environments where it's made very easy at the trade-off of having the level of access you need to get, under the hood, so to speak.
So it's interesting too, because that brings up the point of, while we were running our own virtual server environment, when we saw DigitalOcean and we realized that they kind of figure out those pieces, no problem stepping back and saying, go for it, right? We'll run it there. They're a good relationship. They're a fairly young company, but they've been growing and scaling. So I just wonder if, while we don't see that with something like Now or some other Heroku or whatever that environment is, just to think that, you could on Friday drag and drop a Docker application and it be up and running,
Mhm.
It's a very interesting environment for us to aspire. And fact is if we were doing it, we would probably in some relationship be behind the server, right? Like in
Absolutely.
some
Yeah.
ways, like it wouldn't be like we'd be saying like, no, we're hosting now with another company and like
Yeah.
we're just a go-between. But it's just interesting to me because I am fascinated by this stuff, partially because I'm ignorant, but the other part is because I do think that the ways in which these new server environments invite the notions of like it was interesting because when Tony Hurst called it serverless, and the
Mhm.
idea of serverless that he's talking about, just to be clear on terminology for people who are watching, is you're no longer going and spinning up even a virtual server and then running a Docker container on that. This hosting company now is taking care of all that for you. So
Mhm.
you never even see the server. You just deploy a container and it's being hosted on a server, like you said. But in a sense, it's serverless.
Right.
So the idea for me, I thought of as serverless, headless web development. You know, we need to be call ourselves not reclaim, but hostless.
Hostless.
That's what we need to. I think that's it. Like we are hostless hosters. Just think about the marketing you do there. You don't need us.
Yeah. But please check out anyway. Please, please spend some money. I'm not sure on what, it's all out there in the cloud, but
But I still think there. I mean, for me, now represents and as many of it. He brought up this whole application, and that's what I want to talk about. We need to have Tony on and maybe have him talk about Binder Hub.
yeah.
Because there's another kind of, what he was calling serverless and explaining why it's serverless. And he has a very kind of systematic way of thinking through that, which I liked and was helpful. What does this next generation of hosting live? Like he was talking about the cPanel, which he called first gen. The current generation is something like DigitalOcean. And the next generation might be considered something like Now, which for me is a beautiful kind of like panorama of where we were, where we are, and where we might be going. And I'd love it if Reclaim Today kind of had an ongoing thread, not all of them, but some of them always returning to this idea of infrastructure and how these things scale and what that looks like for us, because I'm always interested in hearing people talk about it or write about it. It helps me conceptualize it, just like when I hear you and Michael talk about, headless web development or Tom Woodward. I dig that.
Yeah, and one of the projects that I want to play around with more it's got a weird name, but it's called Kubernetes. It's developed by Google, and it's related to Docker, but it's sort of like a cloud environment for Docker. But what's interesting, and it's sort of that evolution, is that instead of just running, going from dedicated to a virtual server, now you're talking about an infrastructure where you have multiple servers and they're all kind of connected, and things could be dropped on any one of a number of servers. So instead of saying, I'm on Husker Du or I'm on Minutemen or something like that, it's just sort of like you're really in the cloud because your stuff could be on more than one server. And what's nice with that environment too is that if one of those servers goes down, it'll just pick up on another one, so like it's being duplicated and copied and replicated across that cloud environment. So that's something that I plan on starting to play around with more as we get into looking at Docker containers and that kind of stuff, because obviously you have to run your application in a way that's supported in those kind of environments. But that can be a really powerful thing because then you can have your cloud consist of servers over in New York and some over in San Francisco and some in Amsterdam and all over the place. So,
well,
yeah,
that's a really good point, and it's going to wreak havoc on our naming system. But beyond that, what I really like about that, and what for me is interesting about that, is because I remember about 2015, 2016, when we started to get serious about Linode, because we also used Linode for a while. We played around with AWS, and then we decided to stick with DigitalOcean. I think that was a good decision. But I think the thing that struck me is when Linode had that week outage in Atlanta in their data center, and luckily we only had a couple of things there. But when we lived through that in terms of like a couple of, I don't remember which, like that camp might have been down, or
it was their Atlanta data center, and they were getting DDoSed to hell, and just I guess could not deal with it. And luckily, Linode was where we were putting a lot of virtual servers, but we had been putting a lot of them in, I believe it was a
Newark.
Newark, yeah, data center, and so none of those were affected by it. VCU rampages and other programs and projects that we were running, but that camp.org was affected, and one other one that I can't even remember.
Yeah.
But luckily, it was just 2 servers, but it was like a week, and it was up and down and up, and then it'd be down for like 2 days, and they would just continually be saying, "We're trying to work and deal with it," and our hands were completely tied. We just had to sit there and watch the fallout happen with that, and it was awful.
Yeah. Which is the other side of using data centers, and it's like one of the things we've been thinking about is like. And now that you talk about Kubernetes or Kubernetes or however we want to pronounce, I'll pronounce it wrong just because of who I am. But I do think like that starts to bring up questions of failover.
Yeah.
And so at one point, a node in DigitalOcean goes down. I mean, they had issues in Amsterdam not that long ago, the Easter massacre, right? Like where basically like someone's sysadmin life was hell for a day on Easter Sunday.
Yeah.
And Amsterdam had a problem with their storage, basically. I think it was with their block storage.
Right.
And shit went to hell. And people were out for 36, 48 hours. And at this point, for us, that becomes a really big question mark.
Right.
Like, how do we mitigate for that?
Yeah, and cPanel hasn't yet built in a lot of tooling to help out with that at all. It's still very much framed in terms of that management software as you're running it on a server and you're good to go. And if you want to do replication, you'll do it at the site level. Like somebody could set up their own little rsync, situation and that kind of stuff. But they don't do things like replicating databases. They don't do things like clustered computing at all with that. So I do think like getting there is probably going to mean also moving away from cPanel. So it's going to be a big move in general. We're talking, changing out, the management side of things, both for the end user and for us. We're talking about like real infrastructural change when we talk about Docker versus just LAMP environments. And so a lot of change necessary, I think, to make that happen. Not impossible to do it by cPanel by any means. We'll probably talk about it on another episode, I'm sure, where we recently did this with a huge multi-site VCU rampages. And it's possible to do it, but there's a lot of manual work involved, and there's no tooling in cPanel to assist with that. So I ironically was using information from DigitalOcean on how to set that up. So yeah, it's interesting, but I think there are a lot of benefits in moving strategically but slowly towards this aspect of hosting and infrastructure.
Yeah, and it feels like that was what the last 2 years was about. And getting at DigitalOcean was a real I definitely have felt good about the move and being done with reliable site and not looking back. But what's coming is, it's probably going to be a recurring theme on Reclaim Today, as it should be. But what's coming and what that looks like, and being on virtual servers like we are now will make whatever our next move is, I imagine, fairly cleaner than it has been with the dedicated servers between IP addresses and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. I think this was a big milestone, and I'm excited for what's coming.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking, do you know the Jim Carroll song?
I don't.
People who died. So he does this song where he wrote the Basketball Diaries, and he was like a junkie from New York, and he Leonardo DiCaprio played him in the movie. That was the Basketball Diaries, a book he wrote about him being a young addict. But anyway, he wrote a song called "These Are the People Who Died," and it would be like, Jimmy sniffed glue, jumped off a building, he died, right? And then it's like, little Mary took too many red pills, she died, and it goes on. Billy got leukemia. It's not a very uplifting song, but we could do a version of that with our servers, like. Who's to do was on reliable site. It died.
I think that would be let's commission the Dead Mook Men to put something like that together.
Awesome.
After their incredible performance at our last conference, I think people are just itching for more from them, and so we want to give the people what they want.
I think one of the misconceptions about the Dead Movement, I'm going to be clear here, is that talent is not what punk ever defined punk rock. And I think that really is why, I think punk rock has moved away from his roots, and it's all about like, indie rock. But right, it was really about talentless people performing pretty poorly. And I think people couldn't get that. And like emptying a rooftop bar like that was what punk rock was really like in 1979.
Well, hopefully that's not too much of a metaphor for how the migration went this weekend. I don't.
Yeah, are you all right? I mean,
I'm good. Look at me. I'm young. I feel great, man. I feel really good.
You look good, man. I'm telling you. This migration was good for you, I think. It kept you on your toes.
Was therapeutic. They always are in different ways.
Are you going to miss them?
Oh, I don't think they're gone. For some reason, I imagine we'll continue to do them in some way. But
yeah, it's true. I think, though, but when I think about it, I remember Zach Davis said to me, and I know you want to end this episode, but I'm not going to let you. Zach Davis said to me, like, the hardest thing about if you go into, hosting, which he's like, you're stupid too. But if you go into hosting, the hardest part is going to be keeping your infrastructure updated.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
And I think we've kind of nailed that.
Yeah, I recently, not recent, I mean, it was in the last 6-8 months, something around there. But we run 2 name servers, NS1 and NS2.reclaimhosting.com. And they actually run a stripped down version of cPanel specifically for DNS. And they've been running very reliably since the start, since 2013, with no issues at all. However, they run on CentOS 6, not CentOS 7. And cPanel is no longer issuing updates for CentOS 6. That's end of life. And they started by saying, we're not going to update the DNS software anymore because for whatever reason. So it stopped getting updates completely. They still function fine. And I finally decided, okay, I'm going to need to update this. And unfortunately, there's no just update my operating system button like there is in Mac or Windows. For when you have to move from major distribution, you're essentially reinstalling the server at that point. And so, and luckily it was virtual already, so I could take a snapshot of it. Luckily, it's duplicated. You have NS1 and NS2, so I was able to take NS1 down and rebuild it, and then move everything back over to it and bring it back online. And I did that a couple months ago. I haven't done NS2 yet, but even stuff like that, where it's suddenly you find out like, oh, I've got to, rework these things and basically, start from scratch on another server and then migrate over again.
Yeah, the snapshot tool where I'm about to do something and I take a snapshot of the server before it all goes wrong, saved my ass at least 3 times in the last 6 months. Yeah. And so I've become addicted to it because I know, like, even if something goes wrong, I can replace back to that snapshot I took. And it costs, because you can delete it once everything's done. So it costs you pennies. Yeah. And it's no time. It's crazy.
Yeah. Makes things a lot more flexible. I think Daphne is wanting us to finish up our episode, though.
I don't know. I think you're blaming Daphne, but it's you. I'll get off. If you want me to get off, I'll get off.
What's the name of the new dog?
Oh, you're going to like it. So instead of Marmaduke, it's Babadook.
That's literally the name of the dog?
Babadook.
Babadook. Okay.
Yeah, it was Duke or Duca, but I hate the name Duca.
Yeah.
And so I changed it to Duke. And then I realized Baba, you know what Baba means in Italian? It means spit.
Really?
And the dog is a drooler. It drools everywhere. So when I said to the kids in Okinawa, I was like, you know what this dog should be called? Babadook.
Babadook.
They were finally like, yeah. So the name is Babadook.
Nice.
And it's awesome. A freaking handful. I took a 2-hour walk with him at 6:30 in the morning just to keep his energy down because he's a hunting dog and he can jump. Like, he could probably jump over a 6-foot wall. Like, no shit. Like, he's got, like, springs for back legs. So he jumps like a horse. And when he jumps, he's huge. He's a big dog. He looks like a horse jumping.
Wow.
It's amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah. I think I got in over my head.
I know the feeling.
All right, buddy.
Hey, it was good talking with you.
Absolutely. Big fan.
All right.
Hey, and look, you have the Mooch videotape behind you.
Do I?
Was that on purpose?
It wasn't, but look at that. Yeah. Mooch goes to Hollywood.
Mooch goes to Hollywood. And Babadook goes to Italy.
That's right. It's awesome.
Beautiful. All right, Timmy.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, all.
Bye.